Hello, listeners, and welcome to Season 3 of the Cold Vault podcast. I'm your host, Kacey, and I wanted to update this introduction to offer a few additional trigger warnings about upcoming content. As you likely know, this is a podcast about cults, extremism, coercive control, and abuses of all types. A platform for survivors and victims to share their experiences, change misconceptions, and help advocate for and educate others. Given the recent election results in America and the nature of upcoming interview themes, I wanted to remind listeners that each episode comes with a content warning for themes of murder, abuse and harm, and abortion rights and restrictions. Please take care when listening to each installment. Self-care practices may include being outside for walks or gardening or leaning into friends and family and loved ones, or participating in an activity that brings you joy, like a trip to the cinema, or exercise, or taking a nap. Whatever self-care looks like to you, be sure to practice these things when listening to this material and any other material like this. For early access to ad-free episodes, you can find me on patreon.com/thecultvault for as little as £1 a month. Thank you so much for my patrons for being such a beacon of support, and I look forward to our monthly video call catch-ups at the end of each month. Lastly, I'm so very excited for my favourite weekend of the year in June 2025, CrimeCon UK in London on the 7th and 8th of June. Partnered with True Crime, this is going to be the biggest and busiest and best CrimeCon UK to date, with expert speakers, survivors and advocates of justice taking to the stage to discuss their work in the field of true crime. It's the UK's biggest true crime event, and it's jam-packed with talks and events throughout the weekend, with the most flexible ticket options available, including day tickets, night tickets, weekend tickets, concessions, and different options for payment plans available now at crimecon.co.uk. I will be at the event. I'm so glad that I've been invited back again, and hopefully you will see me up on the big stage, and I look forward to seeing you all there. Head to crimecon.co.uk and use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, at the checkout for 10% off your tickets. And patrons, you can contact me for an additional reduction in ticket prices. Now, on to today's show.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host, Kacey, and today I am going to be talking about something completely new and different on the podcast. I'm so happy to welcome Ken Good from the Good Law Firm. Hi, Ken.
Hi, thank you so much for having me early this morning. I'm an attorney. I am located in Texas in the United States. I specialize in bail law. I represent bondsmen across the state of Texas and several sureties. And I've become, I guess, knowledgeable on this area of law. I've written many articles. I wrote an article probably 10 days ago that was published in the Attorney at Law magazine, talking about rising crime. The way I got started or interested in the legal issues is, someone asked me to attend a hearing on a federal case in Houston. And so I went to the hearing, and I was very upset when I came out because I thought the judge was going down the wrong road. I thought she was making a wrong ruling. I thought she was applying the law incorrectly. And so when I came out, I started calling friends and clients, and I said, we have to become experts on this area, because if we don't, no one else will. It's kind of like, if you don't tell your story, nobody else will tell your story. And so I started looking at these issues. I have an appellate type mind. I used to be an appellate attorney. And so I started looking at the appellate issues that arose or arise in these cases. And I think I was ultimately proven right, because that judge has been reversed 7, 8, 9 times now in her case. And the appellate court finally held that case should have never been filed in federal court. And so, that was probably the most important ruling so far in the United States on bail and federal litigation to try to, where activists get involved and try to force a county or area to do something that they would not otherwise have agreed to do.
Here in the UK, our justice system works slightly differently when it comes to bail. So if somebody is in jail and is awaiting bail, then a criminal justice authority like the court, police, serious fraud office, or financial conduct authority can grant the release of somebody on bail. Sometimes that will be with restrictions, or a set of restrictions, like you have to remain at this address until you're called back in. It's very different in America, and I'm not actually sure how it works. I think I have an idea of how it works, and I don't even know if it's like on a state-to-state basis. But the majority of my knowledge comes from watching shows that I imagine are not realistic.
Well, I do agree with, I guess to start with, I would say our system of bail came with us as a part of our common law from England. So it dates all the way back to when our settlers came back and came over from England. It looks like it developed in a very different way since then. But you're correct. We have the federal system. So we have the federal criminal justice system, which in the United States, most of our law enforcement, our prosecuting crimes is at the state level. And so we have our federal system for bail, and then we have the state system, and every state is different. We have 50 states, and we probably have 50 different ways for handling bail. So some of the things I'm going to say are similar among various states, and some things are very different. Like our federal system is probably very closely similar to, in broad strokes, to what you're talking about. It's really a release-detain system. That's what our federal system is right now. And the problem is when it was reformed, probably when President Reagan was in office, it was intended to release more people. And at that time, we held 25% of the people who were arrested pre-trial, and we would hold them until their case was resolved. Because of those reforms and over time, we now detain 75% of the people who are arrested in the federal system pre-trial, and we hold them till their case is resolved. Now, that can only be done because the federal government is a small component of law enforcement in the United States. On the state level, if the states were holding 75% of the people that they arrest, the system would collapse. They don't have the money for it. They don't have this infrastructure. They don't have the capacity for it. So we have this system where we set a bail amount. It's considered, it doesn't have anything to do with guilt or innocence. It has what is the assurance that you're going to give the court that you will return to answer the charges that are pending against you. And that can be currently in Texas, that can be a cash where you just post the whole amount in cash, or it can be a private surety bond, or it can be a personal bond, which the court grants to you. And so all the things that you mentioned are conditions, additional conditions that can be placed on that bond, like a GPS monitor, stay at home, don't do drugs, don't do alcohol, stay away from the person who filed the charges against you. All those things we consider conditions on bonds in Texas. But there are other states where the very bond itself, the amount, would be a condition of release. But in Texas, all releases have to have a financial consideration. It may be the whole amount in cash. It may be a private surety posting it for you so that if you don't show up, they have to pay it to the county. Or it could be a personal bond where it's just your promise, a pinky promise that you'll show up for court. We have those in different states. They call different things. In Texas, we call them personal bonds. In New York, they call it release without bond. In California, they call it release on zero bond. But all of those things are called, I would call them simple release mechanisms, where we're releasing them just on their promise. And the problem with that at the state level is we don't have, again, the infrastructure to go get them back. I mean, like, look in Harris County, Houston, Texas, which is the third largest county in the country for the United States. If you don't show up for court and you've got a personal bond, then they issue a warrant. The warrant goes down to the warrants department, and it joins the tens of thousands or even more of other warrants waiting to be served, which means you're just waiting until they commit another crime to bring them back into the system. We don't have the U.S. Marshals like the federal system does. And so that's where we get chaos when right now we're doing all these reforms in the areas, and now they're starting to roll them back because they don't have the infrastructure to hold people accountable without the private industry. There was a former judge who was a mayor on a News Nation town hall, and she said, until we have an alternative to the private industry that has the same level of accountability and the same level of getting people to court, we don't have an alternative. And that's the problem. We've got areas of the country that are trying new things that have never been tested, that the science is starting to show that they don't work. And they're trying, and so they're replacing something that does work with something that doesn't. And they're shocked or are ignoring when we have chaos as a result. And in the criminal justice system, what we have to understand is chaos creates de facto decriminalization. Decriminalization creates a green light for criminals to say, hey, I can commit more crime.
So this is the concept that I've read about in your work when you talk about zero bail. And
that's what California calls it.
Right. And that's the kind of some of the intended benefits that you've just described there in terms of reform and trying to get away from using the private sector and people and companies within the privatized area, but the safety and rights of the community, especially concerning domestic violence and related crimes to those criminals or perceived criminals. If they're out on bond, then I guess it's innocent until proven guilty. I don't even know if you do it that way over in America.
Innocent until proven guilty applies at trial. It doesn't apply on release, because release is what assurance you're going to give the court you're coming back. That's all it is. So it doesn't have anything to do with guilt or innocence.
So what are some of the biggest concerns that come with the concept of zero bail and people not coming back? Is it that it's perpetuating crime, or does the crime seem to be escalating? And what kind of insights do you have in the statistics of kind of pre and post this concept of zero bail?
Well, the biggest problem these simple release mechanisms have is to the failure to appear rate. You know, you have to start with you have to understand that if you don't show up for court in the United States, unless a very limited exception applies, that case has to be put on hold because we can't go forward without you there, because you have the right to confront your witnesses against you and you have all these constitutional protections. So if you don't show up for court, your case is put on hold. These simple release mechanisms like zero bail have a very high failure to appear rate compared to the private industry. So like the private industry, you would have a less than 10% chance of not showing up. Zero bail has like an 80% failure to appear rate. That just sounds so fantastic. It couldn't be true. So let's just say 50%. And you can see how over time, a 50% failure to appear rate versus a 10% does substantial damage to the criminal justice system. And these aren't stupid numbers. I mean, according to HarrisCountyCourtWatch.com, that's what the failure to appear rate is in Harris County misdemeanor courts over a 2-year period for simple release mechanisms, personal bonds. And then I did a podcast with the DA from California, and he said they use zero bail or simple release mechanisms across the state for misdemeanors in California, and they get an 80% failure to appear rate. And so, you can imagine the impact. So what does an 80% failure to appear rate do? Well, in California, on a misdemeanor, you have a limited amount of time to get the case resolved because it's the speedy trial requirements. And if you don't get it resolved during that time, the case gets dismissed. So you can see people playing games with the system because it's a misdemeanor. They can't make you come back if you don't want to. And so if you don't commit another crime, then your case will expire and you'll be dismissed. In Harris County, I looked at the dispositions for 1 month, and over 90% of them were dismissed. And so you can see how failing to appear for court is very important to the criminal justice system. And they keep saying, oh, these are just misdemeanors. These are doing great harm to the criminal justice system. And it's bleeding over into the felonies now. I mean, the biggest way it's impacting felonies is we've got states like California that are changing certain felonies to misdemeanors. That's what happened with Prop 47. They changed theft under $950 from a felony to a misdemeanor. And then prosecutors in certain urban areas said, well, we're no longer going to prosecute theft under $950. Well, you and I, people with common sense, would go, well, that's going to lead to incredible amounts of shoplifting. And that's exactly what has happened. Businesses are closing. A business can't withstand $25,000 a day of shoplifting. And so now on the ballot, 10 years later, we've got a thing in November, just in a few weeks, to roll back that original proposition that has done so much damage to the criminal justice system. And what people didn't think about at the time is when you start greenlighting shoplifting, oh, it's just a minor crime. It's just a crime of necessity. What impact does that have on our commercial properties? I mean, in the United States, it's had huge impacts. I mean, in the last couple of weeks, there's been buildings in Minneapolis where they have similar problems, sell for 9% of their value from the last time they sold. In San Francisco, we've got commercial buildings selling for 30%, 50% of the value from 4 years ago. And then we've got the Nancy Pelosi federal building. She's this former Speaker of the House, where they just announced to all the federal employees there in the last year, work from home. It's not safe for you to come to the office. These all have impacts. And, and when you start saying, well, we can't prosecute our way through drug crimes. Well, drugs account for almost 80% of all crime in some way or another. So when you give up on drug crime, well, people see that. And you go, we've turned over our inner cities to gangs, organized crime, and career criminals. And you start thinking, what would our career politicians be doing any differently if they were in the pockets of organized crime? And you go, well, I can't think of anything they would be doing differently because they've turned over these inner cities to these groups.
Yeah, maybe they already are. Maybe there is already some kind of complicity. And I was thinking exactly gangs and organized crime when you were talking about the kind of dismissal of misdemeanors or cases altogether, because of course there are hierarchies that are in operation within these types of groups. And if there are people on the lower rungs of the hierarchy that can be used to perpetuate these crimes for gangs and for criminal networks, whether they're underground or above ground, then of course the criminals are going to always find a way to exploit any vulnerable system. Just like when you find cult leaders, finding vulnerable populations of people to exploit, you're always going to be able to find people like domestic abusers that abuse the legal system to continue harassing and harming the person that they abuse in post-separation abuse cases. Sometimes we're trying to change the way that we changed our Domestic Abuse Act in 2021 to include things that attempt to stop post-separation abuse in the legal system, like a person's right to not face their abuser in court, and things that would probably cause a lot of harm to somebody that had been abused.
So what happens in the UK when somebody's accused of domestic violence? Are they held or are they released with restrictions?
I think it's dependent on the crime. I was looking just before we started talking, and it was interesting when you said that you followed our common law, because we changed the way we do bail in the late 1800s. So we probably did it very similarly in some aspects up until the 1890s. But the reasons we changed the way that bail was done was to reduce the number of people in remand in custody, simply because most of the criminals that were being put into jail were too poor. So the jail houses and the prisons just became overflowed with people. I mean, that doesn't sound too different to what we hear today, but
yeah, the problem with when you do stuff like that is today your prisons are completely full, but they're full of a completely different caliber, a lot more dangerous person. And so you've set up a system where, the misdemeanors of today are your felons for tomorrow. And so it becomes much worse. But what we were talking about is domestic violence people. And, we have too many examples where someone's accused of domestic violence and then they get released, because in the United States, a first offense domestic violence would be a misdemeanor. You have a right to hold them because it's domestic violence, but it's a misdemeanor. We don't hold misdemeanors. And then they get out and they go and kill, the accuser. And so we've had too many examples of that. I mean, we had a terrible example of that in Houston where, he was already on a personal bond for leaving the scene of an accident and he got accused of domestic violence. And so he got arrested again. He should not have been eligible for another personal bond, but he got one anyway and got out and went and killed her and stabbed her 30-something times because she was pregnant. And he said he did not want another man to help raise his child. And that's part of the problem we're having. Before, where we're seeing really bad bail reform is in urban areas, because that's usually a Democrat stronghold. And so we've got these really awful advocacy groups going in and then putting up a very far left person to be the district attorney. And then they're pushing for these god-awful things. But we're talking about domestic violence. And so before these reforms, domestic violence survivors really could not rely heavily on the criminal justice system, because it just is not made for helping somebody pre-conviction. But post bail reform, if you're in one of these urban areas, you can't even think about going to the police. You've got to first figure out your escape plan, figure out what your support system is going to be. How are you going to survive after you get away? And then as almost an afterthought, okay, we're now going to try to hold them accountable. And that's, I mean, when I talk to domestic violence survivors in these areas where they're trying bail reform and doing these god-awful things where just release everybody and all these cases are backlogged, I'm like, you figure out your escape first and your support system. You figure out how you're going to live and then come back and think about the criminal justice system.
Well, and I suppose for you and the work that you do, that just feels kind of backwards for somebody to have to go through that process of.
Well, but it's that way. So many crimes right now. Can you imagine? I mean, we've got. I mean, probably 5 years ago in Houston, nobody would be released on a murder charge on a personal bond, and we went through a period of time where I was telling groups, you're like a dog, you get one free bite. You get one free murder before they're going to hold you in Harris County. So in Houston, Texas, you got to murder somebody, you're going to get out. And, for a while they were giving them personal bonds, and then they would murder somebody else. And then suddenly they go, oh, well, maybe we should hold them. I'm like, why are we doing this? We know what works. We're getting away from them because of these advocacy groups, that were coming in, filing all these lawsuits, arguing you will either do it or a court will order you to do it. And I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, they will argue the same thing no matter how many times they get reversed on appeal. I mean, the last case that I mentioned already, I mean, after it was, the decision was made and the judges at the Court of Appeals said this case should have never been filed in the federal courts in the first place. They were quoted in the, Dallas Morning News saying, there has been no trial court that has not agreed with us and held that bail is unconstitutional. Well, they left out. And so I sent a letter to the editor, which was published, saying, yeah, they just left out that every court of appeals that has looked at this issue in an appeal of one of their cases has reversed. And yet they keep making the same argument. And I listed the cases that they've been reversed on.
Oh my goodness, it must be extremely frustrating seeing not only cases in Texas, but further afield.
Well, it's really upsetting to see how these advocacy groups are really developing the policies that our one of our national parties is advocating for. For the last 4 years, every time we have a national election and crime comes up, the national party argues the same thing. Crime is not going up. It's really just a perception issue. That is what the advocacy groups are arguing. I did a debate with someone from this law firm that's filing these lawsuits, and that's what they're arguing. Oh, crime is not going up. It's a perception issue. I wrote an article 10 days ago that was published in the Attorney at Law magazine talking about the reason why they say crime is not going up. They are citing the FBI statistics. Changed the way that they follow crime 4 or 5 years ago. It's in transition. There are the 2 largest law enforcement agencies in the country are not even reporting to them. The scientists say that this is not complete data. It's incomplete and it's probably not accurate. There's other federal agencies that follow crime. And so the CDC, according to them, homicide rates are up 20%, contrary to what the FBI stats say. And then there's some statistics surveys that the DOJ does that just says crime's through the roof. And so what happened, I wrote this article. It was published 10 days ago. Yesterday, it was discovered, and it was just took off on the national news that the FBI has quietly revised their crime statistics because they left out tens of thousands of violent offenses. Now, I'm not stupid enough to say that was because of my article 10 days ago, but I just think that the timing is so interesting that I went to the trouble to write an article to say there are problems with the FBI crime data, and here's the reasons why. And then 10 days later, it's discovered that the FBI has quietly revised their numbers to show that not only has crime gone down, it's gone up in 2022, contrary to the narrative. Of course, we're 20 days away from an election. The advocacy groups and one party are all in, have been citing that for months, saying, oh, crime's not up. It's because the FBI says it's down. And so now they're just completely ignoring what the FBI revised numbers are.
There's some statistics that are used in arguments where that's solely looking at prosecuted crimes, because if there is this idea of simple release mechanisms, then a lot of those kind of criminal acts won't be registered anyway because the criminals are never truly prosecuted.
Well, that is having an impact on crime as well. I don't know what happened in the UK, but probably similar to the United States, where the courts were shut down for a year. And so, but we were still arresting people, probably not as many, but we were still arresting people. And, I just imagine in your mind that the criminal justice system is a conveyor belt. So it's always moving. And we're always adding, on average, the same number of cases every month to the conveyor belt. I mean, imagine our conveyor belt stopped moving for a year. And so that creates a huge backlog. The courts already had a backlog, so the backlog got even worse. Well, this type of release that you use has an impact on the backlog. So, where you have less than a 10% failure to appear rate or a 80% failure to appear rate, I mean, let's do simple math. 1,000 cases scheduled to show up for a week. Less than 10 means less than 100 don't show up. Well, they get pushed to the next week. That means the next week you've got 1,100 cases that need to show up. Well, but if it's a simple release, 1,000 cases, 800 don't show up. The next week it's 1,800 cases. The next week it just gets worse and worse and worse. And you can see how there's this pressure to dismiss cases, which is de facto decriminalization, because the system will just collapse otherwise. But we do have a lot of data that started coming out during COVID. In California, there was a DA from Yolo County that tracked and compared release of people on simple release versus release on the private industry surety bond. And he found that, and these are all people that were released on simple release because they were considered low-level crimes. And he's found that for anyone released on a zero bail had a 200% greater chance in the next 18 months that they would commit a violent offense compared to a similar person released on a private surety bond. I mean, if you were a parent and you looked at those statistics on just the type of release, you would go, well, I don't want my kid released on zero bail. I want my kid released on the private industry bail because I want somebody looking over their shoulder to make sure that they're going to do what they need to do because I want them to straighten up. And instead, we have all these arguments that are being made. Oh, they can't afford it. They can't, we've got too many poor people in jail. We've got too many people of one race in jail. And what people don't realize is those arguments are actually making the situations for those individuals worse because now we release them on simple release and they've got a 200% greater chance of committing a violent offense, moving up in the criminal justice system, going through the criminal justice education system to today's misdemeanor becoming tomorrow's felonies, and being the next person who's going to be in the prison system after committing a violent offense. I mean, we are being very short-sighted on this.
There's definitely lots of material available on the psychology of reoffending and the cycle of reoffending that people find themselves in. And a lot of the time, what is cited in that type of research and studies is the economical or socio-economical status of an individual that does start taking part in criminal activity at a young age and then finding themselves in that cycle of reoffending. And the advocacy groups that you've talked about kind of on the far left, it's really interesting to me thinking about how extremism can take the form of one side and the other. And I talk a lot on this podcast about the far right because we talk a lot about high demand groups and coercive environments. But of course, extremism on the left also happens, and we see that a lot with like the pro-trans and anti-trans movement at the moment. There's very much a call for the right to exist being questioned on both sides of that argument. You know, people that don't believe that trans people should be allowed to exist don't think that those people that have those thoughts should be allowed to exist. So it kind of perpetuates itself and goes round and round in circles.
I mean, the trans issue is not a criminal justice issue. That's but let me give you an argument that kind of goes into both, something that we see that is made in both arguments, and it's illogical. So in the criminal justice world, these advocacy groups argue that when someone's arrested, if they're like 21, they should not be held accountable for their crime because their brain is not fully developed until around 25. So that's an argument that these groups make for why we should be more forgiving on crime for someone who's younger than 25. But these same groups will argue that children who are trans or have been told they're trans, whatever, that even though they're minors, they should be allowed to make decisions that are irrevocable, cannot be changed. And I'm not taking a position on one or the other. I'm just pointing out the illogic in making both arguments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to play devil's advocate and just ask you, with these advocacy groups or these critics of stringent bail requirements, when it's left and it's not too far left, are there some pros to those advocacy groups that are fighting for not fairer chances, but for just on behalf, I suppose, of certain criminal cases?
Well, I think we're always looking for ways to improve the criminal justice system. I mean, even, the bail system is so intertwined. I think what your audience may not understand is that the private industry in the United States is so intertwined with the criminal justice system. So whatever is good for the criminal justice system is usually good for the private industry bail system. And so to say that, we're trying to prevent things from improving is just not true. we're always looking for ways to improve the system. The problem I have with where we are in these arguments is there's really no compromise with these advocacy groups. If they can't even admit crime's increasing, if they can't admit that the arguments that they're making are actually hurting the very racial groups that they say they're trying to help, that they're hurting them more than helping them, that they're siding with murderers over the victims. And if we can't have that discussion, then it's kind of hard to find a middle ground for compromise. And I would say that right now we cannot find a compromise because they're kind of on the crazy fringe of criminal justice reform. Because right now, when they're cooking the books and saying crime's not increasing, there's a reason for that. They can't admit it. If they were to admit recidivism is a lot higher than what they're cooking the books to say, then their whole foundation for what they're doing would fall. You know, in New York, they've rolled back their bail reform 3 times now. And if the politicians were to admit to the public, well, we knew that this was going to increase crime when we did it, but we were doing it for the policy, for our party, not for the state. Well, there would be such a huge backlash. That's the reason why they can't admit it. I mean, we're at the point now where, you know, you and I would say, okay, this isn't working, so let's try something else. They can't do that.
So in terms of the work that you do now and how much that's changed over the last decade or so, how much has bail reform affected your practice and the broader legal community overall?
Well, Texas has done bail reform, but it's done bail reform in the opposite direction. It's strengthened the criminal justice system. And so it's limited these simple release mechanisms for violent offenses. And, you know, probably the most important reform that Texas has done is the requirement that judges review criminal history before setting bail. I mean, you know, before 4 years ago, there was no requirement in Texas law that you review a criminal history in setting bail. And that just doesn't make common sense.
No.
But there was a reason for it. We didn't have a system in Texas we didn't have a database for you to look at. And so part of the reform was to set up that database. But how has it changed for me in the last decade? I mean, it's really kind of interesting when a member of the legislature stands up in the committee or stands up in the House of Representatives for the Texas House and calls my name, and it's derogatory. You know, we need reform, but we can't have it because of people like Ken Good. And it's not something that you really want to happen. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not a name dropper, and I don't want my name mentioned in either a committee or the floor of the House. Even as a compliment. I mean, it is nice working with legislators, educating them, but, you know, when one of them says, well, you're the expert, I'm like, well, that's a very nice compliment, and I appreciate that. But I mean, honestly, if someone gives me a bill, I'm going to give them what I really think about it. Is this good or bad? If this will improve the system, if it will not improve the system. But the thing that's changed, I think the most, is the motivations. I mean, you know, right now we have rumors of one surety that's going to propose a bill to completely reform the way bail is regulated in Texas. And in my opinion, they're just doing it because they want their market shares dropping, and so this would make it easier for them to increase their market share. That bill would never pass in Texas, and it would be so easy to attack. So I don't think they would be silly enough to allow us to make those arguments against them. But there's all these rumors that their market share is dropping, and so they're looking for ways to increase it easily. And so we'll see. I mean, our legislative session starts in January. It's only once every 2 years in Texas, and so they can start filing bills in November. So that's pretty quick. And so, you know, we're ramping up for a new legislative session in January. Our organization will, or my group will file bills that are not file. We will propose bills to legislators that we think will help the system, and we will testify on those, and we'll testify on bills that we think will not. And then we'll also testify on bills that other members of our coalition, like our domestic violence groups, sheriff's organizations, and other allies that we ask us to reach out on their bills as well. We've become very sophisticated in the last 10 years. We've actually developed our own software for tracking bills and advocating for them. It's kind of interesting when we go to an office to talk to them about a bill and their background. They just keep getting emails, and they're like, we're now up to 350 emails and on a bill that we're either supporting or opposing. So, I mean, probably when I started, we were carrying around notebooks. Now we all have either our phones or our iPads, and we have everything digital. We have a digital folder. We don't have notebooks anymore.
Kind of like a upgraded murder board where you have the red string from thing to thing, and now it's all electronic. It must help when it comes to tracking the sheer amount of stuff in Texas alone, let alone kind of countrywide. And do you keep an eye on kind of policies, legislations, and reforms that are happening in other parts of the world as well, or do you kind of just leave it at the work that you're doing?
Well, I like to say, look, I'm only interested in Texas, but, we do follow other states. We have a national group that follows other states, and so they're a good resource. And also we can use that data from other states, like, Illinois had just passed a bill several years ago, limiting charitable bail organizations because they wanted to limit them to misdemeanors under $2,000. And so Georgia passed, and that went through the courts and was upheld. So that's good information to take to Texas, who's looking to do further restrictions on charitable bail funds, where you can say, well, here's a bill from Illinois that's already been litigated. And so if you do something similar to this, it's been upheld. You're not even going to get sued. And then you can say the Georgia bill that went even further is currently being litigated. So do you really want to go there? But there's a part of it that gives jurisdiction over certain parts of it to both the sheriff and to the attorney general. That would be a nice part, probably not something subject to litigation. So I think we're a great resource on those types of issues. It's showing them, Texas has a proposed constitutional amendment that they were going to propose for the third legislative session now. And it has an element that I just don't like, where judges are required to use least restrictive conditions in setting bail. New York put that in their reform, and they have their third rollback was to take that out. And so it's important to note that we're proposing that as a constitutional amendment, but New York took it out of their bail reform. Now, why would we be doing something that New York, which is supposed to be left of left, is admitting didn't work and took out?
It makes me wonder. I don't like to think of myself as a conspiracy theorist, but I always try and work out a logical reason why someone or something would try to do something that we already know doesn't work. And then I start to wonder if there's personal gain, if somebody's stock shares or company prices would go up and down if a certain decision was made. And that's kind of the way that my brain works sometimes, especially when it comes to
well, I think they're all these reforms, or you can track them back to the same advocacy groups. And so they're always pushing the same things. And when they have something that doesn't work, their response is, well, we just didn't give it enough time. And so they're always going to be arguing for the same thing. They just think we need more time. Of course, the public has very limited patience when crime starts increasing. That's one of the problems we're having. And I've noticed that y'all have had some issues over across the sea as well on crime, and the public will demand public safety. That's why I'm always hopeful on criminal justice reforms that go astray, because the public will demand public safety. And we've kind of been through this cycle before. We went through it in the 60s where we felt safe. And so we started being more forgiving on our criminal laws. And as a result, crime started going up. And then we started having a discussion what to do about it. But we had one party, just like we do today, that refuses to participate in the discussion. And so there was a backlash. And in the 80s, we had Ronald Reagan in his war on drugs as a backlash to, being more forgiving on crime. We're going through that again. It's been the pendulum has swung much further to the left, probably because of these advocacy groups. But that just means that the pendulum will swing just as hard to the right when it does. And we're in the middle of it swinging. And I keep saying to these, when I speak to groups, the left can control how hard we swing back to the right by just acknowledging it's not working. Their refusal to admit it, by saying crime is not increasing, by just by saying you're wrong with what you're seeing with your own eyes, that your eyes are lying to you, that is going to cause the pendulum to swing even further. And they think that they can weather it one more election.
So then we would start to see things like martial law and extreme things in the streets where kind of like...
No, I disagree. Not with the left in control. The martial law
No,
would be
I mean
more
when
from
it
the right.
swings back over.
Yeah, no, that's not what it would be. And when it springs back to the right, when it springs hard to the right, it will be more detention instead of release. And so, the federal system is release or detain, and 75% are being detained. So a swing hard to the right would be states going to the federal system, which is not sustainable. They can't do that. So what they need to do is swing to the right, but have a hard level of accountability. People have a right to release, but if you are released and you don't do what you're supposed to do, then you're held. I mean, that's a more doable system, more sustainable system. But the problem is when you swing to the left like we are right now, that's not sustainable and the public won't stand for it. When it swings like we're talking about to the right, that's not sustainable and the public won't stand for that either because they won't pay for it.
This role that you have as a legal advisor or consultant, is that...
A legal...
An expert, yeah, I think that can good. When you're doing your other role as a trial attorney, do you feel like those two things are separate or are they blended together at this point?
Well, I mean, I used to have a lot of, I used to probably do 50% bail and 50% attorney case type stuff. And I used to always have one big case going at a time. But I really don't have time for that anymore. And I'm just getting older. So really my practice right now is bail. And, that can involve so many different things, like a hearing on whether something that a bondsman did, whether that was something that they need to be punished for, or getting licenses, answering licensing questions, and then, bond forfeitures to make sure that when someone doesn't show up for court, to make sure that the court enters the right and correct order under Texas law. And so that takes up a lot of time. And then writing articles, and, like in the federal, the courts kind of have gotten out of bail reform right now. The last ruling I've already mentioned said that this case should never been filed, but what they really ruled was the federal courts should not get involved in the day-to-day management of ongoing state criminal cases.
And looking forward to the future, you mentioned there that your work seems to be leaning more slightly towards the bail advisor and consultancy work. Do you see yourself moving into that full-time, working less kind of boots on the ground, but more like writing and advising?
No, I'm crazy busy, and I feel like I'm part of this group that I'm like, my wife is also an attorney, and she works as a staff attorney for a federal judge. And she told me, and she's 10 years younger than me, and she's like, here is my retirement plan. I am going to retire in 3 years. And she's like, and people at my office are asking, when are you going to retire? And I'm like, first of all, I'm hyper. And so as long as I'm in good health, I will keep working. But I don't know if I could get out right now. I probably a couple of weeks ago was like, wouldn't it be nice to retire? Well, it might be for a week. I mean, I get cabin fever really quickly, and I like to stay busy. But I don't know. Like you've already said, like we've had this morning, I got a call, and I get calls all the time. And so I'm crazy busy. I've got another friend who does similar work for a different insurance company. And he and I have talked. He would like to retire, but he just, he's like, he tries to get out, but they just keep pulling back in.
Advice would you give to new lawyers or advocates working on bail reform or defending clients affected by these new policies coming through?
I really would like to give some good advice to people, and especially for new advocates coming in. If we can't have an honest discussion, and honest on both sides, But if you're on the advocacy side and you're arguing something that has been reversed 3 times and you're still arguing it and you're not pointing out that you've argued it 3 other times and it's been reversed, well, if you're an attorney, that's a violation of your code of ethics. But ethics don't really seem to fall into bail reform arguments anymore. It's all about the money. If you want to get money to support your advocacy, you have to argue for things that probably are bad for the criminal justice system. And I don't know how to fight that. I mean, I wish I could go to our billionaires, millionaires and say, I want to talk to you about this, because what you're doing is actually creating more harm. It's making lives worse for these criminals because they're now going to become career criminals. They're going to commit felonies, and you're creating a system that is just worse for them and for their families. But you're arguing that you want to favor the criminal over the victim for some reason. You know, we have a DA in California that in LA County, his name's Gascon, who should be defeated in November in a few weeks. But he actually argued, well, you know, we just have a disagreement over who the true victim is. They think the true victim is the criminal defendant, not the person who had the crime committed on them. And I'm really critical of that. The whole basis of our criminal justice system is, you know, the state is the voice of the victim. Well, if the state suddenly just is arguing for the defendant, well, then there is nobody in the courtroom who's arguing for who is the voice of the victim. So no wonder people are saying, well, why would I report this crime? I mean, nothing's going to be done to them. I mean, in fact, I'm just putting myself under a spotlight by these groups, by these career criminals, by these gangs, by these organized crime. And so they'll get out in less than, you know, in a few hours. And then I've got a big target on my back. So, I mean, that's one of my big problems. It's all, and I go back to a point you made. Who benefits from chaos? I mean, who benefits from chaos? We have some advocacy groups that, you know, a coalition that some people would argue that some of the big money people on that side benefit from chaos because that's some of the ways they make money. I don't know. I think part of the coalition is made up of true believers. They're trying to help, but they're misguided, because I think if you were to say, okay, I want to help, but I realize that this is not, it's making crime go up in these same minority areas more than anywhere else, that I'm going to say, no, this isn't working. We got to do something else. But that's what we're not seeing. That's what we are not seeing from these groups. That's why I say we can't compromise, because they will not admit something's not working. We just need more time. The statistics are wrong. It's a perception issue. No. I mean, if I live in the middle of an urban city and my Walgreens closes, my pharmacy closes because they can't withstand $25,000 a day of shoplifting, where do I get my drugs? I mean, where do I get my groceries? And now it's a much less safe for me. But we're not going to. We can't keep our property, commercial property, safe for people to go shopping. The values drop. The tax bases drop. I mean, our default rate on commercial properties has gone from 5% to 41%. I mean, that causes collapse. Your tax base collapses. I mean, that requires the federal government to come in and bail you out. I mean, the Republicans aren't going to bail out an urban city that allowed that to happen. So, of course, the Democrats want to stay in control. And they keep hearing that the other party is a threat to democracy. And I just go, is the other party a threat to democracy or a threat to the Democrats? It's starting to look like, to me, it's just a threat to the Democrats, not democracy.
It's really difficult with some cases that I've researched over here that I imagine some of these advocacy groups would benefit, but it's not a blanket process, and I feel like you wouldn't be able to do it on a case to case basis, but that is how things would need to be things would need to be addressed. There was a case over here of a woman named Sally Channon who was so controlled and abused by her husband for decades. And then one day she murdered him with blunt force trauma to the back of his head. And eventually, with a different legal team, she was able to have her murder charge reduced to manslaughter with diminished responsibility. And I feel like I can understand why that would happen. And I can understand why advocacy groups might want to support certain people for certain crimes if you look at it through that lens. But I don't think you can do it on a blanket scale and just say all people deserve the same legal everyone's allowed the same legal processes, but the same legal support that Sally Channon had with her particular case.
Well, probably the biggest argument we hear is that, the private surety bail system takes advantage of the poor. And, if you have means, you always get out. And that is a very simple argument, and it flies in the face of what the purpose of bail is. So when I'm arrested, the judge takes into consideration, have I ever been to court before? Have I ever been arrested before? And when they look at my criminal history, they're going to see a whole bunch of speeding tickets. But they're not for when I was a lot younger. But they're not going to see anything else. So for purposes of our criminal justice system, I would be a first-time offender. And a first-time offender, no matter what your means, is very rarely held. Because, those are the people. Our criminal justice system is built on the concept we want to give you the least amount of pressure to make you reform to become a productive citizen. And so, but if someone else was arrested and they had a long criminal history, well, their bail should be higher than mine for the same charge. I don't think anybody would dispute that except for these advocacy groups, because they're setting up bail systems where it's a charge-based release. No matter how many times you've been arrested for it in the past, it's the same charge, so everybody should be treated the same. That's not how bail is meant. It's meant to be individual. So if I've been arrested 5 times before and I have means, then my bail is going to be higher versus someone who's poor and has 5 charges or been arrested 5 times. Their bail is going to be less, but it still may be a point where they can't afford it. But you know what? Those are the people that need to be in jail. They're not in jail because they're poor. They're in jail because of their criminal history. If they didn't have a criminal history, their bail would be released to something less. And so I disagree with this argument, because they're saying, well, if they had means, they would get out. If they had means, their bail would be higher. That's the whole concept of individualized review of a person in setting bail.
Well, I can't imagine, if I somehow or for some reason did commit a crime and my bail was set at the same as somebody's who had committed that same crime a number of times, and this was my first felony, I imagine that has an impact on the way that people experience the justice system as well.
Well, I'm sure the UK is a lot like the United States. Politics gets into everything. Politics has reached a new level in the criminal justice system. It's almost to the point where we're only prosecuting crimes against our political opponents. It hasn't, but it's almost to that level. It seems that way, and it's undermining the public's confidence in the criminal justice system. And where it's really hurting us is, so Houston, Harris County, they've decided that, okay, we're just too busy. We have too many people that are getting arrested, so we're not going to prosecute this crime anymore, like usually marijuana.
Gosh.
But then right next door to Harris County is Montgomery County, and they do prosecute that crime. And where it really is right now is catalytic converters. And so somebody steals it from your car. Organized crime can make thousands of dollars from it. They've learned how to make millions of dollars from it. And, people that, and we're saying, oh, that's a low-level crime, so we're just not going to prosecute that anymore. Well, those take off. And so, there's a great story on Facebook from the Montgomery County Police Department where they were saying they arrested somebody for catalytic converter theft, and they were driving them to the jail. And they were like, wait a minute, this isn't how you go to the Harris County jail. And they're like, well, you were in Montgomery County when you committed this crime, and Montgomery County prosecutes this crime. And they were like very upset. Oh, crap, we got to a different county, and this county is crap. Well, what are we going to do now? I mean, that's where we are. I mean, the public doesn't have confidence in the criminal justice system that does that. I mean, that's why in Texas you see the legislature enacting a statute for the that allows for the removal of a DA who does things like that.
Oh my gosh, this has been such a learning journey for me today. I just wanted to answer a question that you asked earlier on how the UK handles bail for domestic abuse and domestic violence. For anyone listening who is also wondering, in the UK, domestic abusers can be released on bail or held in custody after being arrested and charged, depending on the decision of the police and the Crown Prosecution Service.
So bail, but the word bail in the UK means release on conditions. So it's a simple release mechanism, and they put conditions on you, which are, things on you that you have to do, and we would call it conditions in Texas. But in Texas, bail is something completely different. It has to be a financial amount, and there's only 3 types. Cash bond, we have to put up the whole financial amount in cash, or it's a private surety bond, or it's a personal bond. A personal bond, it says the amount, but there's no surety. It's just your promise. Y'all's is just a release or detain with conditions.
I think sometimes as well, there are cases where it takes a long time for a person to be released on bail because they do have, they'll have an ankle bracelet put on, or they'll have to find a suitable address that the police are happy to release them to, and things like that. But yeah, it does kind of it's similar but different to the way that.
Well, I like to hear that the sheriff and the police have a say in the release, because I think that's the boots on the ground will probably have a better idea of those things. In Texas, we actually are having a little bit of an argument, and part of the bail reform in the United States is who should be responsible for setting bail. Currently in Texas, it's the judge who sets bail. And, you can file a motion to lower it or reconsider it at any time. But it's the judge, he sets bail on abusive discretion standard, which is a very hard standard to get reversed on appeal. Some of these areas that are doing bail reform want to take that away from the judge and make it an issue. You have to do a mini trial within 72 hours of arrest on the issue of whether the defendant should be detained. Well, so then it's a clear and convincing evidence standard. Did the DA meet their standard of proof? And if they don't, then the judge has no discretion, but has to release the defendant. Well, that's not in the interest of public safety. The DA may not want to release some of their evidence within 3 days of arrest. They may not be ready with some of their evidence within 3 days of arrest. And we're saying that public safety issues hinge on that? That's ridiculous.
That also kind of, I suppose, links in with why some parts of the legal system, well, all parts really, are just overwhelmed with the sheer number of cases coming through. Because that feels like a lot of additional steps that you have to take.
It does. And then when you add on it, this whole thing where they can miss. Look, in the reforms they did for misdemeanors in Harris County, said they had to miss court 3 times before you could do anything to them. And so when I pointed out, look, you got an 80% failure to appear rate, what did the courts do? Well, they quit requiring defendants to show up for court until the very end. So that makes it even worse, because you're only showing up at the end. Well, you got 3 times when you don't have to show up and they can't do anything to you. That puts more pressure on dismissing the case. And so it shouldn't be a shock that they're dismissing 90% of the cases.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we wrap up our conversation today, Ken, and this has just been eye-opening and fascinating for me to learn some of the surface level stuff of the work that you do. As someone who is deeply invested in the outcomes of legal battles, what keeps you motivated in your work, especially when you face challenging cases and public criticism?
Well, I would like to say I have a thick skin, but I probably don't. And so what keeps me motivated? Look, the private surety bail system is made up of some of the best people I have ever met. When I started in this industry, I'm so old, 30 years ago, when a bondsman died, his business died with him because nobody else in the family knew how to run it. But now, 30 years later, we have second-generation bondsmen, third-generation bondsmen, people who know exactly what they're doing and know how to get people to go to court. I mean, when a bondsman, you have trouble to get to court, well, the bondsman knows what impact that's going to have on you, but also them. So they go and get you and give you a ride. I mean, these are some of the best. I consider them blue collar people that I've ever met. When I first started working for this industry, I just found people that I matched what I grew up with. And so I don't think people realize what hardworking people these are. And so when I speak on behalf of the bail industry, or when I speak on an issue that is something that affects the bail industry, I feel this responsibility to do a good job and to represent these men and women of the industry who work so hard. And I think that our criminal justice system, which is going afield in some parts of our country, I think that they do not realize that they could make it so much better just by leaning on the private industry more. And then I would just say, in our urban areas, I don't think we even disagree that our government has failed families. You know, we have broken families all over the place in our inner cities. They failed schools. Our dropout rates are incredible. They've failed us on drugs. I mean, the drug rates in our inner cities are just awful. And they've also failed on economic opportunity because, you know, we had all these riots and protests. They burned down businesses and large numbers of them didn't come back. So the ability to find work in our inner cities has gone down. And yet these same advocacy groups are now saying, we will now fix all this in our criminal justice reform. They haven't fixed it. They have failed these racial groups, and I think they're starting to see it. And so, when the NAACP in Oakland demands a state of emergency on crime, it's hard for these left of left groups to argue that crime is really not increasing. It's just a Republican talking point. I've never seen the NAACP of any city issue a Republican talking point. So I think we need to get the politics out of crime really bad, but it's really hard right now. And we could do a whole episode on why we can't get politics out of it right now, because it's a long answer and it's very detailed. And we're starting, I've got groups that are reaching out to me on how do we combat that. And so I think that will be the next step.
Well, I think it's something that we will hopefully revisit on the podcast as things continue to change, especially post-election, because I wonder how much that's going to change the work that you're doing or shift the work that you're doing in one direction or another, depending on which way the vote swings. And I appreciate you coming here today and giving us all of this new information and a whole new area to consider when we talk about the idea of combating coercive and controlling behavior across all areas on micro and macro levels in countries and on continents and around the world. It's really fascinating to me to learn about how smaller systems propagate larger systems of coercive and controlling behavior. And this is just one pocket or one area that is going to be allowing other areas of controlling environments to just bloom. Unfortunately, it's going to be propagating somewhere, and it probably has a further reach outside of America as well. I'm sure the ripple effect is felt just through this one system throughout other parts of the world. So thank you so much, Ken from the Good Law Firm. I'm going to be putting links to your website in the episode description, and hopefully we can keep in touch and you can keep us apprised of things that change, and maybe some of your policies and legislation, maybe some of the work goes through. Who knows?
Sure, absolutely.
Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'm sorry that I asked you to meet with me so early in the morning.
No problem. I'm always up early. I just usually am working out that time. So but it was very nice meeting you. It's nice talking to you, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Ken. Take care. Bye.
Bye.